Can you imagine the person you raised, the one you loved unconditionally, looking you in the eye and telling you your voice no longer has any value? I was there, sitting at my own table, surrounded by my family, when my daughter-in-law, with a coldness that chilled my soul, declared, "Don't ever speak your mind again." What I'm about to tell you is the story of how one sentence, spoken in an instant, can destroy an entire life, and how silence can be the loudest and most devastating response. Imagine a lifetime dedicated to a land that is more than a business. It's your lifeblood, your legacy, and one day, that same land becomes the battlefield in a war you never asked for. That's how I felt, a voiceless vineyard, a witness to how my vines were disregarded by the very hands that were meant to care for them. Today, you'll discover how a simple humiliation led me to make the most difficult decision of my life, one that would change my family's destiny forever. Every second matters, because if you let this lesson pass you by, you risk being robbed of your peace by the disrespect of your loved ones. Stay with me until the end, because I'm going to show you the only act that gave me back my dignity. You can't imagine what I did when I got up from that table, and how that silence turned into the loudest scream my family has ever heard. My name is Donato Fernandez, and I'm 84 years old. I live in a large house, one of those that smell of old wood and aged wine, on the outskirts of Logroño. The estate where I grew up and worked all my life is right behind it, a sea of vineyards that change color with the seasons. I know each vine like a child. I got married here, raised Luis, my only son, and said goodbye to my wife 15 years ago. Since then, I've been the one who keeps the heart of this land alive, although lately my health reminds me that winters weigh more heavily. That morning, the air smelled of fermented grapes. It was late September, harvest time, and from my window I watched the day laborers gather the last rows. My body no longer allows me to bend down like it used to, but my mind remains just as alert. In recent months, Luis and Laura, my daughter-in-law, had begun to make more decisions. I allowed it, thinking it was time for them to get more involved. However, I soon realized that their idea of modernizing the farm had little to do with what I had built. Luis was always quiet, more of a follower than a leader. Laura, on the other hand, is one of those people who fills a room with her voice and her plans. She speaks quickly, moves her hands as if catching the air, and always seems to be in a hurry. Since she joined the family, she has hinted at selling part of the land to invest in projects I barely understand. She calls it progress. I call it letting go of what sustains us. That night, the three of us sat down to dinner in the dining room. The table was made of solid oak, the same one my father used to gather us at, to talk about the harvests and life. On it, Laura had placed a bottle of wine that wasn't from our estate, a detail that stung me like a thorn in my side. While I broke a piece of bread, I listened to them discuss the possibility of selling the upper part of the vineyards, which always produce the best Tempranillo. At first, I remained silent, observing, but when I heard Laura say that with that money they could diversify and leave the old behind, I couldn't hold it back. I cleared my throat and said, "That land." I didn't get to finish the sentence. Laura looked at me with that tight smile that is more a gesture of impatience than affection and said, "Don't give me another opinion, Dad. We've heard enough. Now leave it to us." I felt like someone had poured a bucket of ice water over me. It wasn't the first time he'd interrupted me, but that sentence was like a door slammed in my face. I looked at Luis, searching his eyes for any sign of defense, but all I found was a downcast gaze, fixed on his plate, as if the crumbs were more important than what had just happened. I didn't say anything. I wasn't going to give them the spectacle of seeing me upset. I put the knife on the tablecloth, wiped my mouth with my napkin, and stood up slowly. Each step toward my study was like walking down a long hallway you know by heart, but that suddenly seemed strange. I closed the door behind me, rested my hands on the desk, and took a deep breath. Anger and sadness mingled, in a silence that hurt more than any words. I opened the right-hand drawer where I keep important documents. There was the contract, prepared months before, when I began to feel like my voice was no longer being heard. An agreement with a rival winery, people I've known for decades and who respect the land just as I do. I took up the pen. My hand trembled a little, not from doubt, but from the strength of the decision. As I signed, I felt like each letter was a brick in a wall that separated me from my son and his wife forever. I sat for a moment, staring at my signature at the bottom of the page. There was no turning back. Outside, the murmur of dinner continued, interspersed with the clinking of cutlery against plates. It was as if nothing had happened, as if my absence held no weight. That indifference tightened my chest more than any screaming. I slipped the contract into a leather binder and left it on the corner of the desk, ready to be sent first thing in the morning. I opened the window to let in the fresh night air. The smell of damp earth hit me full force, mingling with the distant aroma of the winery. I stood there, staring up at the black sky studded with stars, thinking about how many times I had done this with my father, and then with Luis when I was a child. Back then, he listened attentively, absorbing every story about tending the vines. At what point did he stop caring? I heard footsteps approaching the study. The door opened slightly, and Luis poked his head inside. "Is everything okay, Dad?" he said in a neutral tone, as if asking out of courtesy rather than real interest. I answered with a simple yes, without rising from my chair. He didn't mention dinner, Laura's words, or my sudden departure. He simply nodded and closed the door. That silence between us was worse than any argument. I was alone again, and my mind began to replay every detail of the past year. The decisions they made without consulting me, the meetings with investors I wasn't invited to, the times Laura corrected me in front of the staff as if I were a clueless old man. It wasn't that I was hurt by losing control, it was hurt by losing respect. And that night, at that table, they had made it clear. To them, my opinion was no longer worth anything. I got up from the desk and walked into the kitchen. The table was already empty, the dishes stacked by the sink. Laura was talking on her phone in the living room, her voice animated, as if she'd just closed an important deal. She didn't see me pass. I went up to my bedroom and opened the closet where I keep the few things I truly consider mine. A wool jacket handmade by my wife, an old clock inherited from my grandfather, and a folder with photographs of the estate over the decades. I sat on the bed with the photos on my knees. There was a picture of my father, his hands stained with grape juice, smiling after a day of harvesting, and another, of Luis, barely 6 years old, holding a bunch of grapes, as if it were a trophy. I wondered what they would think of what I was about to do, but deep down, I knew the answer. They would tell me to stand firm, that the land belongs to those who respect it. I barely slept that night. I heard every creak in the house, every gust of wind against the shutters. I imagined Luis and Laura's faces when they found out about the sale, and I was torn between a slight sadness and a strange feeling of relief. It was as if, finally, I was closing a chapter that had been slowly rotting away. At 6 in the morning, I got dressed, grabbed the folder with the contract, and left before they woke up. The sky was beginning to lighten, painting the vineyards in shades of orange. I walked slowly toward the car, breathing deeply, savoring each step. I knew that when I returned, everything would be different, and although it hurt, I also felt that for the first time in a long time, the decision was solely mine. I drove slowly along the secondary road that borders the estate, the one I'd traveled thousands of times in my life and could follow with my eyes closed. The morning mist curled around the vines like a thick blanket, and the dew on the leaves glistened in the first rays of the sun. As I drove, I felt like I was crossing a passage between two worlds, the one I'd always had, marked by work and tradition, and the one that was about to begin, more uncertain, but mine. I passed the old iron gate my father had forged in his youth. I remembered him, teaching me how to close it tightly so the neighbor's cattle wouldn't come in and destroy the vines. Those memories hit me hard, but instead of stopping, I gripped the wheel and kept going. I arrived in Logroño when the streets were still half empty, with only a few bakers opening their businesses and the aroma of freshly baked bread wafting through the sidewalks. I parked in front of the notary's office, a stone building with a solid wooden door that had seen better days. Before getting in, I lingered inside the car for a moment, watching my own reflection in the rearview mirror. I saw an older man with wrinkles that resembled furrows, his gaze tired but steady. He wasn't a defeated man. He was someone who could still make decisions. I took a deep breath, got out of the car, and walked toward the door with the contract under my arm, feeling the cold metal on the handle as I opened it. Inside, the notary, Don Ignacio, greeted me with the cordiality of someone who'd known me all my life. He'd handled the estate's paperwork for decades and knew something like this could only mean a weighty decision. "Are you sure, Donato?" he asked as he flipped through the document. His voice wasn't judgmental, but respectful, as if he understood this wasn't just about selling land, but about setting a boundary. I nodded without saying anything. He prepared everything with the meticulousness of a watchmaker, reviewing every clause, and I signed silently, feeling each stroke of the pen. Close a door behind me. When he finished, he handed me a sealed copy and shook my hand firmly. "I wish you peace with your decision," he said, looking me in the eyes as if he knew it wouldn't be easy. I put the papers back in the folder, and as I stepped out, the cold morning air hit me in the face, dispelling any doubts. My hands weren't shaking, my chest wasn't aching. Instead, I felt strangely calm, as if I'd put the pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to put together for years. I walked back to the car, aware that every step brought me closer to the inevitable conversation with Luis and Laura. On my way home, I stopped at a small roadside cafe, one of those places where the waiters call you by name and know exactly how you take your coffee. I ordered a cortado and a tostada with tomato. While I waited, I watched people come and go, each immersed in their own day, unaware that I had just made a radical change in my life. I wondered if, for others, important decisions felt like this, silent, without trumpets or announcements, but with a weight that accompanies you with every sip of coffee. I returned to the farm around noon. From the driveway, I saw Laura on the porch talking on the phone, gesturing as usual. Luis was by the tractor, checking something on the engine. I parked slowly, and before getting out, I watched them for a few seconds. At another time, I would have felt proud to see them there, tending the land. Now I saw only distance, as if we were in separate worlds. I got out of the car, the folder under my arm, and walked toward the house with firm steps. Laura hung up the phone when she saw me and smiled, a smile more polite than affectionate. "You got up early today?" she commented. I didn't respond. I walked straight into the dining room and placed the folder on the table. Luis followed me, wiping his hands with a rag. "What's that?" he asked, frowning. I sat down and opened the folder, letting the silence fill the space. I felt her eyes on me, but I wasn't in a hurry. After years of listening to others fill in the blanks with words, I'd learned that silence also speaks volumes. Finally, I slid the contract toward Luis. "The farm is no longer ours," I said without raising my voice. I saw how he first frowned, then how his eyes widened as he read the first lines, and finally how his face tensed. Laura walked over and snatched the document from him, reading it quickly. "What? You sold everything? To whom?" she asked, her voice rising. "To someone who respects this land," I replied. "No more, no less." And at that moment, I knew the conversation was just beginning. Laura slammed the contract back onto the table, as if by doing so she could undo what had already been signed. Her face was flushed, and her tightly pressed lips seemed to contain a mixture of fury and surprise. "This doesn't make sense, Donato. How can you do something like this without consulting us?" she said, in that tone that no longer sounded like a daughter-in-law's, but rather like someone who believes they have the right to over you. Luis, on the other hand, said nothing. He placed his hands on the table, his knuckles white from clenching, staring at a fixed point as if he didn't know where to begin. I sat there, hands clasped together, feeling that every second of silence weighed more than any words. "Consult them?" I repeated, letting the question hang in the air. "After you told me not to give my opinion again, do you really think my decisions need your permission?" Luis raised his head then, and I could see a mixture of embarrassment and something resembling guilt in his eyes, but he didn't dare say anything. Laura snorted and took a step toward me, as if she wanted to physically impose herself. "You didn't mean to take it like that, it was a misunderstanding," she began, but I interrupted her with a wave of my hand. I had no intention of listening to excuses. I leaned back in my chair, breathing slowly. "The land belongs to those who care for it, not to those who see it as a bank account," I said, pronouncing each word as if it were a precise pruning. Laura opened her mouth to respond, but Luis stopped her with a slight movement of his hand. That gesture surprised me. It wasn't common for him to intervene between us, and for a moment I thought maybe there was a spark of understanding. But then I heard him say, "Dad, this affects us all. You can't decide something like this just out of pride." Pride. That word pierced me like a thorn. Pride? Pride is continuing to work the land with muddy hands and a broken back so that you have something to inherit. Pride is not selling out to the first person who offers easy money. What I did today wasn't out of pride. It was out of respect. I respect my father, my grandfather, and every grape harvest that was done here without thinking of cutting corners. I replied, feeling my voice tremble a little, not from weakness, but from firmness. Laura slumped back in her chair, crossing her arms, clearly frustrated. So what? Are you going to be left with nothing? Are you going to let strangers manage what you built? That question made me smile, but not with joy. I'd rather let them manage it than have you destroy it out of haste or ambition. At least I know you'll take care of the vineyard as it deserves, I said, recalling the conversations with the purchasing winery, their commitment to tradition and quality. Luis lowered his gaze again, as if words weighed more than any argument. Silence filled the dining room again. Outside, the wind rustled the branches of the almond tree I planted when Luis was born. I realized that this scene wasn't just an argument over land or contracts. It was the end of a chapter decades in the making. It was the moment when a father stopped being a guiding figure and became just an old man making his own decisions. And somehow, that gave me a strange peace. I stood up slowly, picked up the folder, and tucked it under my arm. There's no more talk. The deal is done. The property is no longer ours as of next week. You can stay in the house until you decide what to do, but the land, it's no longer ours. I felt their eyes on my back as I left the dining room, but I didn't stop. I crossed the hall to my study and closed the door. Outside, I heard a murmur among them, but I didn't want to make out the words. In the silence of the studio, I sat by the window, looking out over the vineyards for the last time as their owner. The afternoon light fell on the leaves, painting them gold. I realized that although it hurt, I felt no regret. The decision had been made, and more than a loss, it felt like reclaiming something, my right to be heard, even if it was only by myself. In that moment, I understood that what I had done was not an act of revenge, but of dignity. The days following that conversation felt strange, as if an invisible tension hung in the house, permeating every corner. Laura stopped greeting me in the mornings. Her footsteps echoed quickly through the hallway, and she slammed the doors more loudly than necessary. Luis, for his part, avoided being alone with me. He came and went quietly, sometimes without even warning, as if afraid any word might reopen the wound. I, on the other hand, followed my routine, having an early breakfast, walking around the property, and sitting on the porch watching the day laborers bustle about, aware that soon I would no longer be the one setting the pace in that place. The atmosphere at meals was particularly dense. The three of us sat, but we barely exchanged a couple of trivial phrases. The sound of cutlery against plates seemed louder than ever. Laura constantly looked at her phone, as if waiting for important news, and Luis ate quickly without looking up. I didn't make an effort to fill the silences. I had learned that silence could also be a form of response. Sometimes, amid that stillness, I thought about how everything had changed in a matter of days, although the truth was that the change had been brewing for years. On the fourth day, I received a call from the new owner confirming a visit with his winemaking team. They wanted to tour the estate, take notes, and plan the upcoming harvest. I welcomed them without hesitation, and we arranged to meet for Saturday morning. When I hung up, I saw Luis standing in the studio doorway, staring at me with a mixture of disbelief and bewilderment. "Are you coming?" he asked, as if there was still a glimmer of hope of turning him around. "Yes, and I want to be there to greet you," I replied, without further explanation. Saturday dawned with a clear sky and fresh air smelling of damp earth. I got up before dawn, put on my wool jacket, and went out onto the porch with a cup of coffee. I heard a car engine approaching and saw a black SUV pull into the driveway. 3 people got out: the new owner, a man in his 50s with weathered hands, a young woman taking photos with a professional camera, and a technician carefully inspecting the vines. I greeted them with a handshake and a frank look, sensing that, even though they weren't family, they shared my respect for the land. From the dining room window, I saw Laura watching the scene with her arms crossed. Her expression wasn't just one of anger, but something more: helplessness. Luis was standing next to her, but he didn't say anything. He barely followed the visitor's every movement with, his eyes. I walked around the farm with them, explaining details about each plot, the history of the soils, the grape varieties, and the specific care that gave them their character. It was a transmission of knowledge that, at another time, I would have imparted to my son. Now I was imparting it to those who ironically knew how to listen. During the tour, the new owner told me he wasn't planning on changing the name of the farm or uprooting any vines. "This is history, Donato. Don't touch it," he said, and I felt a lump in my throat. I wasn't expecting emotion at that moment, but there it was, reminding me that my decision hadn't been a leap of faith. On the contrary, I had ensured that the essence of this place would survive, even if my last name was no longer on the documents. When the visit was over, I walked them to the entrance. Laura and Luis didn't get out to say goodbye. The SUV started up, and as it drove off down the dirt road, I stood watching the dust rise behind it. I felt like I'd just closed a door that, no matter how hard they tried, they wouldn't be able to reopen. And that certainty gave me a calm I hadn't felt in years. That night, as we ate dinner in silence, Laura put her fork down and stared at me. "I don't know if you'll ever be able to understand what you did," she said, her tone a mixture of reproach and resignation. I looked back at her and replied, "Maybe not, but at least you'll know I did it to protect something that, to me, is worth more than any business." Luis said nothing. He just bit into a piece of bread, as if this conversation were territory he didn't dare tread. The next morning, the silence of the house was broken by a soft knock on my study door. It was early, and I was sorting through some old letters I'd saved from my father. "Can I come in?" Luis asked, barely peeking his head out. I gestured for him to come in. He sat across from me, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if searching for the right words. "I know you don't want to talk about this, but I didn't think things would go this far either," he murmured. His voice wasn't defiant, but tired, like that of someone who's finally dared to spill the beans. I didn't respond immediately. I watched him, recognizing in his slumped posture something I'd previously only seen in myself at the most difficult times. "Luis, things didn't get this far by accident. They got here because you shut me out, and because you allowed others to speak for you," I said in a tone not meant to hurt him but rather to make him understand the weight of his choices. He looked up, and I could see that those words hit him harder than any open reproach. "Laura," he started but stopped. "Laura has ideas, and I thought that I could balance things out. But I guess I was wrong." It was the first time I'd heard a hint of self-criticism from him since this all began. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence fill the space for a few seconds. "It's not just a matter of ideas, son. It's a matter of respect. When you lose that, there's nothing left," I replied. I felt like for the first time in a long time, our words weren't hitting a wall. Luis nodded slowly, as if processing every syllable. Then he looked out the window, toward the vineyards that remained beneath our property until the transfer. "I wonder if there's a way for you to be there again, even as an advisor," he said, almost as if trying to open a gap. I didn't know whether to laugh or, "That's not up to me anymore. The decision has been made and there's no turning back," I replied, with the calmness of someone who has already accepted their path. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but something had changed. Luis started seeking me out to talk about small things: a repair around the house, a tool he couldn't find, a memory from when he was a child. It wasn't much, but in the coldness that reigned, it was like lighting a candle in a dark room. Laura, on the other hand, seemed more distant than ever. We rarely crossed paths in the hallways, and when we did, her gaze was filled with a mixture of resentment and disdain. 2 days later, I received an unexpected visit from a neighbor, Don German, who came to ask my advice about a problem with his harvest. I welcomed him on the porch and we talked for almost an hour. At one point, I saw Luis watching us from the window. I think it was then that he realized something Laura never understood, that my opinion wasn't a hindrance but a tool that had saved more than one harvest, even someone else's. When Don German left, Luis approached me and, without saying much, simply commented, "There are still people who listen to you." That night, while we were having dinner, Luis broke the silence with an unexpected question. "What if we tried working together on something small? Not the whole farm, just a part of it. Something that will get us back into the habit of listening to each other." Laura put her fork down and looked at him as if he had betrayed a pact. I, on the other hand, looked at him calmly. I don't know, Luis. I'm not sure we're ready. But if that day ever comes, you'll know where to find me, I replied. The tension at the table could have been cut with a knife. After that dinner, I went to my study and turned on the table lamp. I took out an old notebook and began to write notes about the vineyards, the cycles, the most common pests, the solutions I'd found over the years. It wasn't to be handed over to Luis or anyone else at that moment. It was for myself to record that knowledge isn't lost even when the land changes hands. Outside, the night wind caressed the leaves, and for the first time in many days, I felt there was a small space for hope, however distant. The day of the transfer dawned with a clear sky, that blue that seems to announce that everything that happens will be etched in your memory. I woke up before the alarm clock rang, feeling like I couldn't waste a minute of that day. I dressed slowly, wearing the wool jacket my wife had knitted for me during one of our first winters together, and went down to the porch with a hot cup of coffee. From there, I looked out at the vineyards, each row lined up like a silent army that had accompanied me my entire life. The air was filled with the sweet, earthy scent that precedes the harvest. I stayed there for a long time, recording every detail in my mind. The new owners arrived mid-morning, accompanied by a notary and 2 technicians. They carried folders, meters, and a gait that betrayed both haste and determination. I welcomed them with a handshake and a brief smile, aware that now they would be the ones setting the course. Luis and Laura were present, but they remained at a distance, like spectators at a construction site whose ending they already knew and couldn't change. I saw a look on my son's face that I couldn't interpret. It wasn't exactly sadness, but it wasn't indifference either. We walked through the plots together, and every time we passed a significant point, the high area with the best sun exposure, the old underground winery, the spring that feeds the irrigation, I told its story. I didn't do it out of nostalgia, but because I believed that even though my name was no longer on the papers, the memory of this place should live on. The technicians took notes and photos, while the new owner nodded respectfully. It was a long journey, and with each step I felt like I was leaving something behind, as if I were removing stones from a path I had built with my own hands. When I reached the small hill overlooking the entire estate, I paused for a moment. From there, I could see the rows of vines stretching out like a green and gold tapestry. I remembered harvesting grapes with my father, the laughter of the day laborers, the smell of freshly picked grapes, and the nights when the work dragged on until my hands no longer responded. Luis approached, perhaps driven by the weight of the moment. "It's beautiful. I've never noticed it like that," he said softly. I glanced at him and wished those words had come sooner. The final signature was made in the cellar, on a makeshift table. The notary read each clause, and I nodded without interruption. Finally, I signed once more, this time not to initiate a deal, but to definitively seal the closure of a period. I felt a strange emptiness, not painful, but like someone putting away a book they've read so many times. They know it by heart. The new owner signed afterward, and the sound of the pen on the paper seemed like an echo taking a part of my life with it. After the signing, there was a brief toast with wine from the estate, still bottled under my name. I raised my glass and without any long speeches said, "To the land, which outlives us all." No one responded with words, but everyone drank. Laura didn't look up from her glass. Luis did, and there was a gleam in his eyes that made me think he was beginning to understand. The new owner shook my hand firmly and promised to take care of every corner of the estate as I had. As the cars pulled away down the dirt road, silence returned. I stood alone on the porch, watching the dust slowly settle. Laura entered the house without saying anything, and Luis stood by my side for a moment. He didn't speak, but his presence was different. Less distant, more aware. We didn't need many words to understand that something had changed, even if we didn't yet know what form it would take. That night after dinner, I sat in my study and lit the lamp. I took out a new notebook and, on the first page, wrote, "Lessons from a life among the vineyards." It wasn't to be published or left as an immediate legacy, but for myself, to ensure that the history and knowledge wouldn't be lost. Outside, the breeze gently stirred the leaves, and for the first time in a long time, I felt I could sleep without the burden of what would come tomorrow. The estate was no longer mine, but my dignity was still intact. The first few days after the sale were strange, as if I were moving through a space I didn't yet fully recognize. I woke up early as always, but I no longer felt the urge to walk around the property to inspect every detail. Instead, I walked around, following paths I'd barely known before. I discovered a small stream less than a kilometer from the house, with clear, fresh water and moss-covered stone benches. There I would sit and listen to the constant murmur of the water, a sound that somehow helped me understand that life continues to flow, even when the stages end. Luis began to move closer, albeit timidly, as if afraid that any gesture would be interpreted as an attempt to recover something he had lost forever. He helped me with small tasks around the house, changing a light bulb, moving a piece of furniture, repairing a door that had been creaking for months. We didn't talk about the immediate past, but in those silent actions, there was a recognition that needed no words. Laura, on the other hand, kept her distance, coming and going without interacting with me more than necessary. One afternoon, while I was standing on the porch, I saw Luis approach with 2 cups of coffee. I was surprised because I had always been the one who prepared and offered coffee in the house. He sat down next to me, looked toward the vineyards that no longer belonged to us, and said, "I've been thinking, maybe I should learn more about what, even if it's too late." That simple phrase struck me harder than any elaborate apology. I didn't respond immediately. I just took a sip of coffee and nodded, letting the moment hang in the air. From then on, we began to share small fragments of my knowledge. I taught him how to prune a young vine growing next to the garden, how to recognize the ripeness of a grape just by squeezing it between his fingers, how to read the weather by observing the color of the horizon at dawn. It wasn't the entire estate, but they were fragments of a legacy that could still be passed on, even though the land was no longer ours. Luis listened attentively, and that was enough for me to feel that something was being repaired, albeit slowly. One Saturday morning, I decided to invite him for a walk to the stream I'd discovered. At first, he seemed awkward, as if he didn't know what to say, but as we walked along, the conversation began to flow. He told me about his fears, how he felt trapped between my experience and Laura's ambitions, and how he hadn't been able to defend my place in the family. Hearing this didn't erase what had happened, but it did open a window through which a new, less reprehensible air entered. At home, Laura noticed that Luis was spending more time with me, and she didn't like it. His gestures were colder, his comments more cutting. One night, as I was passing by in the hallway, I heard her arguing with him in a low voice, saying that she didn't understand why he was wasting time playing vines when there were other, more important things to do. I didn't intervene. It wasn't my role to interfere in that conversation, but inside I confirmed something I already knew. Not everyone is made to appreciate what the earth teaches. As the weeks passed, I realized my life was reconfiguring. I no longer measured my days by the tasks to be done on the farm, but by the small things I could do for myself. I restored a wooden bench that had been abandoned in the yard, organized my library of viticulture books, and began writing more regularly in my Lessons from a Life Among the Vineyards notebook. Each entry was a reminder that my story didn't depend on a title deed, but on what I had learned and could pass on. One autumn afternoon, as the first dry leaves were falling, Luis arrived with a bottle of wine that wasn't ours, but that carried a purpose. "It's not from the estate, but I thought we could try it together," he said. We sat on the porch, poured 2 glasses, and toasted silently. As I tasted it, I smiled. It didn't have the deep flavor of our grapes, but it did have the sincere gesture of a son trying to rebuild a bridge. And in that moment, I understood that, even though the land was no longer mine, I could still cultivate something just as valuable, a new kind of relationship. The change in my relationship with Luis didn't go unnoticed by Laura. Every time she saw us out together or working on something in the garden, she'd frown and retreat to another part of the house. She didn't need to say anything. Her actions spoke for themselves. Luis, for his part, seemed calmer when we were alone. He asked me to show him old tools, tell him anecdotes about the grape harvest, or explain why certain technical decisions made a difference in the final result. It was as if he was trying to make up for lost time by forced marches. And although I knew this interest had come too late, he allowed me to enjoy it without reproach. One Sunday morning, as we were pruning some young vines I'd planted near the wall, Laura appeared on the porch with a cup of coffee. She watched us silently for a few seconds until she said, "Are you really planning on spending the whole day like this? There are other, more useful things to do." Luis looked up and for the first time in a long time replied without hesitation, "This is useful too." His tone was firm, not aggressive, and I noticed a slight tremor in his hands, as if this small defense was a big step for him. Laura didn't reply, but her gaze hardened before she entered the house again. From that day on, his discomfort became more evident. He began spending more time away, running errands that he didn't give details about. He returned late, and when he was home, he avoided long conversations. Luis noticed this, but instead of distancing himself from me, he seemed to cling more to our shared routines. He even started bringing me books on modern viticulture, saying he wanted to understand how the traditional could be combined with the new. This pleasantly surprised me, not because I thought we'd be working together like before, but because it showed a respect that had been absent for too long. One day, while we were sorting through some old tools in the shed, Luis stared at a sickle that had belonged to my grandfather. "I never realized we had so many things with history here," he commented. I told him how that sickle had been used to cut grapes during the post-war harvest, when each bunch was treated like a treasure. He held it for a moment silently and then carefully returned it to its place. He didn't say anything else, but his gesture of returning it with such respect spoke more to me than any speech could have. Meanwhile, I continued with my notebook, jotting down not only techniques and knowledge, but also family stories, small life lessons that don't always fit into a conversation. I realized that writing had become a way to leave a legacy more lasting than any field. Luis asked me a couple of times if he could read what I wrote, and although I was hesitant at first, I eventually let him see a few pages. His reaction was one of prolonged silence, but not indifference. He seemed to absorb every line. Laura, noticing this new connection, began to act with calculated coolness. She no longer made direct comments about what I was doing, but she made sure Luis knew she didn't approve of his time with me. Sometimes she would drop phrases in passing, "Don't forget what really matters," or "Don't lose sight of our priorities." I pretended not to hear, but I could see how those words made him frown. Despite everything, Luis didn't interrupt our dynamic. On the contrary, he seemed more determined to maintain it. One Thursday afternoon, as we sat on the porch drinking coffee, Luis said something that made me think. I realized that what bothered me most about the sale wasn't losing the property, but realizing I didn't value it as I should have when it was still ours. His words were sincere, without drama. I looked at him and replied, "Sometimes you don't see what you have until you lose it. What's important is what you do after you realize it." He nodded, and in that gesture I saw that, although we couldn't change the past, we could write a different present. That night, as I closed the notebook and looked out the window at the vineyards that now belonged to others, I felt the pain of loss transformed into something more manageable. Not because I had recovered what was lost, but because I had gained something I thought was lost. A son who could hear again. Perhaps it wasn't the ending I had imagined, but it was one I could live with in peace. Laura's change of heart soon translated into concrete action. One morning, as I stepped out onto the porch, I saw that the wooden bench I had so carefully restored was gone. In its place was a modern, cold, and history-free metal table. I asked Luis, and he uncomfortably told me that Laura had taken it to storage because it didn't match the aesthetic she wanted for the house. I didn't make a fuss, but I felt as if a piece of me had been ripped out without permission. That bench wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was the place where I sat and watched sunsets with my wife, where I had entertained friends and neighbors for decades. Days later, I discovered that he had removed the clay pots with geraniums that adorned the entrance, which my wife had cared for years. In their place, he had placed minimalist planters with artificial plants. When I asked him why, he replied with a shrug, easier to maintain. His tone wasn't one of dialogue, but rather of judgment. It was clear that he wasn't looking to improve anything, but rather to erase any trace that might remind me of my time in charge of the house and the estate. One afternoon, upon entering the living room, I noticed that the large family photograph that dominated the wall was no longer there. It had been the one that had shown us all during a grape harvest, with my wife in the center, laughing. In its place, Laura had hung an abstract painting in shades of gray. "It gives it a more modern look," she commented when she saw me looking at it. This time, I couldn't stay silent. "That painting could be in any house. That photo could only be here," I said, feeling my voice sound harsher than I'd thought. Laura crossed her arms and smiled with that calm smile she uses when she wants to show that nothing affects me. Donato, things change. You have to make room for the new. New doesn't always mean better, especially when to achieve it you have to destroy what was already good, I replied. At that moment, Luis entered the room and found us exchanging glances. What's going on here? He asked. Laura didn't say anything. She simply left the room, leaving us both in a thick silence. Luis listened as I told him about the photograph, the flower pots, and the bench. He didn't interrupt, but he seemed tense. Dad, I can't control everything Laura does, but I promise I'll talk to her, he said. I nodded, even though deep down I knew it wouldn't change much. Laura wasn't acting carelessly. She was acting intentionally, and that intention was clear, to reaffirm that even though the property was no longer theirs, the house was now their territory. Tensions grew even more intense when, a week later, I discovered that Laura had completely reorganized my study without warning. The books were out of place, my notebooks were piled in a corner, and even the lamp I use for writing had been replaced with a more modern one. When I confronted her, she responded with a phrase that made my blood boil. I thought you'd feel more comfortable that way, less trapped in the past. That sentence confirmed to me that there was no good intention behind her changes. That night, I called Luis to the porch, and we talked for a long time. I told him I understood he wanted to keep the peace, but that there were boundaries that weren't crossed. This house will be yours, but as long as I live here, there are things that aren't touched, I warned him. Luis lowered his head and told me he understood, but that convincing Laura would be difficult. It's not about convincing, it's about setting boundaries, I replied. And at that moment, I knew that if he didn't do it, I'd have to do it myself. 2 days later, Laura tried to remove an old grandfather clock. This time, I physically intervened. This isn't moving from here, I told her, with a firmness that made her back away. She looked at me with a mixture of surprise and defiance, but said nothing. In her silence, I understood that for the first time, I had encountered a barrier I couldn't cross without consequences. The clock incident was a turning point. From that day on, Laura stopped trying to move important objects without warning, not because she understood my position, but because she sensed I was no longer willing to budge an inch. Nevertheless, the tension remained in the air, like a slowly gathering storm. Luis began to notice that living between two opposing wills was affecting the dynamics of the house. One night, while we were having dinner, he put down his cutlery and said in a tone that brooked no interruptions, "This can't go on like this. We need clear rules for living together." Laura looked at him incredulously, as if she couldn't believe he was starting this conversation in front of me. "Rules? Now?" she retorted, slamming her wine glass down on the table. Luis didn't flinch. "Yes, now, because if we don't, we'll end up living on a battlefield, and I don't want that." I watched him silently, surprised that he was finally laying his cards on the table. It was the first time in a long time I'd seen him speak with real authority. He proposed something that, though simple, meant a lot, that there would be spaces and objects in the house that would be untouchable while I lived there. Places like my study, the porch, and certain pieces of furniture and photographs that are part of our family history. Laura tried to laugh at the idea, but Luis wouldn't budge. "It's non-negotiable," he said, staring at her. That sentence made Laura purse her lips and fall silent. She knew he had drawn a line, and that crossing it would mean a conflict she might not be able to control. In the following days, although the atmosphere remained tense, I noticed a change in Luis. He began to take a more active role, not only in his relationship with me but also in household decisions. He asked my opinion on arrangements, consulted me before making changes, and above all made me feel like my voice was once again a part of me. It wasn't like before, but it was an important step. Laura, for her part, maintained a cool courtesy, avoiding direct confrontations, although her gestures made it clear that she wasn't satisfied. One afternoon, while we were drinking coffee on the porch, Luis said to me, "I know I can't undo what happened to the farm, but I want you to know that I won't let this family's history be erased within this house." His words weren't grandiloquent, but they were accompanied by a firm gaze. I replied that all I asked for was respect, and that if that continued, we could live together without wearing ourselves out. He nodded, and at that moment I understood that, although the conflict with Laura would continue, at least I was no longer alone in that battle. Laura, seeing that Luis was more aligned with me, began to be absent more often. He would stay away for long hours, and when he returned, he would talk about possible changes in his life that didn't include staying in that house for long. I wasn't surprised. For someone like her, living under rules she couldn't control was like being in a cage. Luis didn't comment much on his absences, but his expression told me he was processing something that might change the course of their relationship. Meanwhile, I continued with my notebook, increasingly filled with notes, anecdotes, and drawings of tools and plants. I began to think that when I finished it, I would give it to Luis, not as a reward, but as a reminder of everything I had learned over the years. I wanted him to understand that the true value of our history was not in the land, but in the knowledge and respect for what has been cared for by hands and hearts. One night, while we were in the kitchen preparing some dinner, Luis confessed to me, "I've been thinking about talking seriously with Laura about her future, and mine." He said this without looking at me, cutting bread as if it were an automatic gesture. I understood that this statement carried enormous weight, and that probably the conflict we'd experienced had been the catalyst for him to start questioning things he'd previously accepted without thinking. The conversation Luis had anticipated with Laura wasn't long in coming. It was one evening, after dinner, when I heard their voices from my study. At first they were just murmurs, but they soon turned into sharp sentences. "This isn't just about my father, Laura. It's about us and how we live here," Luis said in a tone I'd rarely heard from him. She responded sarcastically, "Since when have you been so clear about what you want? You used to seem comfortable letting others decide for you." That sentence made me stop reading. It was clear the argument was about to escalate. I tried not to intervene, but the voices grew louder. "I won't let you turn this house into something I don't recognize, and I won't let you continue to disrespect my father," Luis insisted. There was a brief silence, broken by Laura's dry laugh. "Respect? He sold us the property behind our backs. If anyone broke anything here, it was him," she said, with a coldness that pierced me even from another room. The words were harsh, but what struck me most was the fact that Luis didn't let them go. "No, Laura. He made a decision because you pushed him to. You didn't want to listen to him, you didn't want his experience to count, and now you want to erase everything he represents within this house. That's not love for the family, it's pride and control," Luis replied. His tone was firm, without the usual hesitation. Hearing him say that with such clarity made me feel a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride for seeing him defend me, sadness for everything we had had to lose to get here. The silence that followed was thick, and then I heard hurried footsteps. Laura entered the living room, picked up her bag, and said coldly, "I'm not going to stay here and listen to this." She walked past my study without looking at me, opened the front door, and left, slamming it shut. Luis didn't follow her. He stood in the dining room, staring at the closed door, taking a deep breath like someone who's just made a decision that will change many things. I stood up and walked over to him. I didn't say anything. At first, I just put a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" I finally asked. Luis nodded, though his gaze was filled with a mixture of determination and melancholy. "I know this could mean the end of many things, Dad, but I can't continue living like this, amidst tension and contempt. I'd rather face the consequences than continue giving in on everything," he confessed. It was at that moment that I understood he wasn't just defending my place, but also reclaiming his. That night was strangely peaceful. Without Laura at home, the atmosphere seemed lighter, although there was also an emptiness that neither of us mentioned. Luis and I ate a simple dinner, almost in silence, but not an awkward silence. It was more like a break after a long battle. Before going to sleep, he told me, "Whatever happens, I won't let you feel like a stranger in your own home." The following days confirmed that Laura wasn't planning on returning anytime soon. She called Luis a couple of times, but the conversations were brief and tense. He didn't give me any details, but from his expression I understood he was holding his ground. I didn't ask too many questions. I'd learned that there are battles a man must fight just to know who he is. In her absence, the house regained a more serene rhythm. We cooked together, worked in the garden, and even resumed the habit of walking to the stream in the evenings. One afternoon, as we sat by the stream, Luis said something to me that marked the closing of a cycle. Maybe losing the farm was what I needed to understand what truly matters. I didn't say it out loud, but in that moment, I knew that, although the price had been high, What I had gained couldn't be measured in hectares or bottles of wine. I had my son back. Laura's absence transformed the house in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the lack of arguments or heated glances. It was the serene silence that allowed conversations to flow without tension. Luis and I began having breakfast together every day, something that hadn't happened since he was a teenager. We talked about simple things, the weather, market prices, some news from the region, but that normalcy was, in itself, a gift. The atmosphere was warmer, as if we had suddenly opened the windows after a long winter. We took advantage of this new rhythm to dedicate ourselves to small but meaningful projects. One weekend, we decided to repair the fence surrounding the garden. We worked side by side for hours, sharing anecdotes from when I first built it and laughing about the improvised repairs I had made with my father decades ago. Luis was surprised by the durability of the old materials, and I told him it was because things used to be made to last, just like the commitments you make. We also resumed the habit of cooking together. I taught him how to prepare a lamb stew I had learned from my mother, and he, in return, showed me some more modern recipes he had tried on his travels. Between pots and knives, we found common ground where differences of opinion didn't matter. On those evenings, the kitchen filled with aromas that took me back to my childhood, and I realized that a farm wasn't necessary to continue passing on traditions. Without the constant pressure of tensions with Laura, Luis began to open up more about his own plans. He told me he was thinking about looking for work outside the farm and wanted to train in modern agricultural management, not to change everything he'd learned, but to better understand how what I taught him could be applied to a modern context. This intention, expressed with humility, made me realize that his learning went beyond the technical. He was regaining respect for experience. Some afternoons, we would visit old family friends. At each meeting, I watched Luis listen to the elders' stories with an attention he hadn't had before. He would remain silent, absorbing each word, as if he understood that these anecdotes held more lessons than any textbook. I watched him with a mixture of pride and relief, knowing he was reconnecting with his roots, even if it was late. One Sunday afternoon, while we were sitting on the porch drinking coffee, Luis said to me, "I've decided that when I start my own project, I want it to bear our last name. It doesn't matter if it's not the farm I used to own, but I want people to know where I come from." That phrase touched me more than he imagined. I replied that it wasn't just a name, but what that name represented: hard work, honesty, and respect for what you care for. He nodded, and I felt that moment would be etched in my memory for both of us. As the weeks passed, I began to notice that I felt lighter myself. I no longer carried the frustration of the sale or the daily stress. Instead, I had found a new mission: to help my son build something of his own, without repeating the mistakes we'd made. I didn't need to control everything. I just needed to be there, as a guide when he asked. And that freedom, for both of us, felt like a breath of fresh air that renewed every corner of the house. I even began to open up to the community more than I had in years. I participated in local viticulture meetings, helped neighbors struggling with their orchards, and was once again invited to talks at the cooperative. Luis accompanied me to some of them, and I saw in his eyes that he understood the importance of maintaining those ties. Maybe we no longer had the farm, but we still had a place, a purpose, and a story worth telling. Laura's return wasn't announced. She simply appeared one afternoon, a suitcase in one hand and her phone in the other. She was wearing dark glasses and had an expression I couldn't read, a mixture of tiredness and determination. Luis and I were on the porch checking some tools when we saw her come through the gate. "I need to talk," she said, without a greeting. Her tone was dry, almost administrative, as if she'd come to close a pending matter, rather than resume a conversation. I simply watched in silence, letting Luis take the initiative. They entered the house and locked themselves in the dining room. From my study, I overheard snatches of the conversation. Laura spoke quickly, mentioning opportunities, changes, and future plans, but there was no warmth in her words. Luis responded slowly, in short sentences, and every now and then there was a prolonged silence, as if he needed to measure his responses. When the door opened, almost an hour later, Laura emerged, suitcase still in hand and a cold expression on her face. Luis walked her to the gate and she left without looking back. When he returned to the porch, Luis sat across from me, visibly relieved, though with a trace of sadness. "She's not coming back, Dad," he said bluntly. He told me they had talked for a long time, and that he had made it clear he wouldn't accept a life of disdain for me or our history. If that meant her leaving, I'd rather accept it now than continue losing us both, he added. His voice didn't tremble. He was convinced of what he had done. I didn't lecture him. I just nodded and poured him a coffee, as if that simple gesture sealed our agreement. The following days were calm, but not empty. Luis seemed determined to fill the space Laura had left, not with hasty substitutions, but with a more conscious presence. He became more involved in household chores, participated in cooperative meetings with me, and even began to write down some of my lessons in his own notebook. I realized that without saying so, he was picking up the baton I had tried to pass on to him years before, but this time not out of obligation, but by choice. One afternoon as we walked to the stream, Luis confessed to me that he had been talking to the new owner of the farm, not to reclaim the property, but to offer his help with the upcoming harvest, learning firsthand and maintaining a connection with the land. I don't want everything I know about this place to come only from you, Dad. I want to see it from the inside too, he explained. That decision struck me as mature and courageous. It meant he was not only willing to learn, but also to reconcile himself with the place from a different perspective. The day he visited the farm with the new team, he returned home with a different smile, one I hadn't seen on him in years. He told me he recognized every corner, that he'd smelled the same scent of earth and grapes that had accompanied him throughout his childhood, and that the new owner had treated him with genuine respect. It's strange, but it didn't hurt to be there as a visitor, he told me. That phrase made me understand that, in a way, we were healing wounds, even if the scars remained. Over time, we began working on a small project of our own, a vegetable garden next to the house with vegetables, herbs, and a few young vines that we planted together. It wasn't a hectare-long farm, but it was ours, and every sprout that emerged was a reminder that you can always start over. Luis was enthusiastic, and I enjoyed watching him invest his time and energy into something he could nurture with his own hands. One spring afternoon, while we were watering the vegetable garden, Luis said to me, "Maybe I didn't inherit the farm, but I inherited something more important, how to take care of it, even though I'm gone." I looked at him and smiled. I knew those words weren't empty praise. They were proof that, despite everything we'd lost, we'd gained something deeper. And in that instant, I knew everything I'd experienced had been worth it. As the months passed, the house felt like home again. Not because everything was perfect, but because every corner regained its identity. The wooden bench Laura had removed returned to its place on the porch, this time with a fresh coat of varnish that Luis and I applied together. The clay pots returned to the entryway, and the family photograph hung again in the living room as if it had always been there. They weren't just objects, they were anchors that reminded us of where we came from and who we were. The garden grew vigorously, and every day gave us something new. Ripe tomatoes, aromatic herbs, small bunches of grapes that we planted diligently. Luis had become a meticulous caretaker, and I limited myself to advising him when he asked. Seeing him like this made me realize that sometimes you don't need to inherit land to have it in your blood. You just need to learn to respect what lives and grows beneath your hands. One morning, while we were drinking coffee on the porch, Luis told me he'd decided to stay home and continue the garden project as his main occupation. "It's not the farm, Dad, but it's our land, and I want what we start here to be something we can enjoy together," he said. That declaration filled me with a quiet pride, not euphoric, but profound. It wasn't a grandiose dream, but it was real, and that made it meaningful. When the next grape harvest arrived, the new owner of the estate invited me to participate as a special guest. I accepted, bringing Luis with me. We walked through the vines, greeting the day laborers, smelling the sweet air of freshly picked grapes. There was no bitter nostalgia. Instead, I felt a serene gratitude for having found a way to close a cycle without being trapped in it. Luis worked side by side with the team, and at the end of the day, over a glass of wine, he said to me, "Now I understand what you always tried to teach me." My relationship with Laura dwindled to a couple of sporadic calls, without open conflict, but also without the closeness I'd once tried to force. It didn't hurt. On the contrary, it gave me peace knowing there was no longer a battlefield within my own home. Luis seemed lighter, more centered, and so did I. We learned that not all relationships are meant to last, and that sometimes Walking away is the only way to preserve what truly matters. Over time, my notebooks filled up completely. Stories, techniques, reflections, everything was written down, not for someone to read as a manual, but as a life account. Luis suggested I digitize them, and I accepted. He told me he wanted to save them so that one day, if he had children, they could learn the family history beyond the words he could remember. That gesture confirmed to me that the legacy was secure, even if I no longer had a farm to leave as an inheritance. One evening, sitting on the porch bench, I gazed at the garden, the house, and the horizon where the farm stretched into the distance. I didn't feel loss, resentment, or sadness. I felt fulfillment. I had made difficult decisions, faced contempt and misunderstanding, but I had preserved my dignity and recovered what truly mattered: the connection with my son and the respect for the history that united us. If I've learned anything from all this, it's that you don't measure your life by what you own, but by what you choose to protect. The farm is no longer mine, but the knowledge, the memory, and the essence of what it represents remain intact. And as long as I can sit here, with a cup of coffee, watching Luis care for what we started together, I'll know it was all worth it. Because sometimes, losing everything is the only way to gain what truly matters. Sometimes I think that all of us, at some point, have had to let go of something that seemed impossible. It could be a piece of land, a relationship, a dream. But what matters is what we choose to cherish afterward. Have you also gone through a time like this? I'd love to hear from you in the comments, to know what you kept with you when everything else seemed to slip away. If you know someone struggling to keep their dignity or their story alive, perhaps this story can help them feel at home. Share it if you think it might mean something to them. We never know when a word or a memory can help someone hold on. And if you want to continue listening to true stories, told with the calm of someone who has lived them, you can stay here. There are many more voices, many more lives that, like Donato's, remind us that even in loss, there are paths to what truly matters. In the end, we're all looking for the same thing: a place, whether physical or in our hearts, where we can sit, look around, and silently tell ourselves that it was all worth it.